Portrait Tuesday, Portrait Tuesday, Portrait Tuesday, we poetry on Tuesday. Okay. It's the extended theme song. Let's do this. All extra credit edition of Poetry Tuesday. This poem is taken though from the AP website. It's an example of one of the newer prompts. So it's helpful. We might look back at this even after break. So if you do it optionally now, you'll just be ahead of the game. How's everybody doing? It's only 7:45, but I'm awake. I've been awake for almost 4 hours. Because I woke up at 4:15, did some work. Because why not? Time doesn't matter. This poem, let's check it out. We're going to look at the prompt, look at the poem. I'm going to read everything. I'm going to point out some stuff. It's this kind of a difficult prompt. And then in the end, you're just going to write a paragraph, and I'll talk about that. In the following poem by Delmore Schwartz, published in 1959, the speaker, 19th century French poet Charles Baudelaire, addresses his mother. Read the poem carefully. Then, in a well-written essay, analyze how the choices that Schwartz ascribes to Baudelaire reveal Baudelaire's complex character. A couple of things I want to say about this prompt. I'm not going to say too much about Baudelaire. I actually know a lot about his life, but they're not giving you any of that info, and I don't think the average AP student would know too much about Baudelaire. So I'm not going to tell you that because I don't want you to use that to help with your reading of the poem, because the AP didn't want you either. Otherwise, they would have given you more biographical information, and they didn't. That's number one. But just know that Baudelaire is a poet, and the prompt tells you that. When it says here that the speaker is Baudelaire, it just means that Schwartz, who wrote the poem, is writing the poem as if he is Baudelaire. And again, it's written in some ways sort of like a letter to his mother, which I think when you get to the last line especially makes sense, that it feels like it's Baudelaire writing a letter to his mother. I'm not going to give you any more information about Baudelaire. We see, as always, this word complex. I'll circle that word for fun. I never use these drawing tools down here. Yeah, we'll do that. So we see that word complex. Bam. So that's a thing, again, that we're used to. It says in a well-written essay, analyze how the choices that Schwartz ascribes to Baudelaire reveal Baudelaire's complex character. That's a difficult question. I had to wrap my head around that a little bit when I looked at that this morning. The way that I interpret that would be basically because Schwartz is trying to talk through Baudelaire's voice. The choices aren't just sort of the decisions that it seems like Baudelaire is making as Schwartz writes this letter in Baudelaire's voice, but all of the choices. So word choice, syntax, all that stuff. Like if this is Schwartz doing his sort of Baudelaire impression, what are the ways that Schwartz makes Baudelaire talk in this poem that say something interesting about who he thinks Baudelaire is? See how that's complex? It's hard to wrap your mind around. But basically, anything in the poem, the way the speaker is talking, the things that the speaker chooses to talk about, the words that the speaker uses, the speaker's attention to detail, what are the details that the speaker pulls out in this case, through those choices, which Schwartz made, but again, he is ascribing to Baudelaire. He's saying, this is Baudelaire talking. What do all of these things tell us about Baudelaire? That's what the question ultimately is asking. And again, it's a complex question, and I could easily see how people would get kind of confused there, to be honest. But so let's read through the poem now. Baudelaire. When I fall asleep, and even during sleep, I hear, quite distinctly, voices speaking, whole phrases, commonplace and trivial, having no relation to my affairs. Dear mother, is any time left to us in which to be happy? My debts are immense. My bank account is subject to the court's judgment. I know nothing. I cannot know anything. I have lost the ability to make an effort. But now, as before, my love for you increases. You are always armed to stone me, always. It is true. It dates from childhood. For the first time in my long life, I am almost happy. The book, almost finished, almost seems good. It will endure, a monument to my obsessions, my hatred, my disgust. Debts and inquietude persist and weaken me. Satan glides before me, saying sweetly, rest for a day. You can rest and play today. Tonight you will work. When night comes, my mind, terrified by the arrears, bored by sadness, paralyzed by impotence, promises, tomorrow, I will tomorrow. Tomorrow the same comedy enacts itself with the same resolution, the same weakness. I am sick of this life of furnished rooms. I am sick of having colds and headaches. You know my strange life. Every day brings its quota of wrath. You little know a poet's life, dear mother. I must write poems, the most fatiguing of occupations. I'm sad this morning. Do not reproach me. I write from a cafe near the post office, amid the click of billiard balls, the clatter of dishes, the pounding of my heart. I have been asked to write a history of caricature. I have been asked to write a history of sculpture. Shall I write a history of the caricatures, of the sculptures, of you in my heart? Although it costs you countless agony, although you cannot believe it necessary, and doubt about the sum is accurate, please send me money enough for at least 3 weeks. That's it. So much in here, so much. So a couple of things. This first stanza is interesting to me because it feels almost like it is apart from the rest of the poem, and that's because this starts Dear Mother, so it feels like a letter starts here, and it feels like this is like a prologue almost to the poem or to the letter that's being written in an interesting way. And it gives us an interesting insight into the mental state of mind that the speaker, in this case Baudelaire, is in. So this idea of hearing voices, right? So it suggests that maybe our friend Baudelaire here is perhaps like, at the edge of his sanity. And then we get into what feels like a letter to his mother. Starts that way. And there's some interesting things in here. There's a lot of very just like literal moments. So we find out early on that Baudelaire is deeply in debt, right? My debts are immense. My bank account is subject to the court's judgment. There's nothing figurative happening there. That's not symbolic. That's just the speaker in this case saying, I owe a lot of people a lot of money. Then we kind of go to something a bit more abstract. I know nothing. I cannot know anything. That's a really interesting line there. I have lost the ability to make an effort. So it seems like Baudelaire here is struggling with motivation. But now as before, my love for you increases, but he loves his mom. You are always armed to stone me. Always. It is true. It dates from childhood. That to me feels like a reference, obviously, the idea of like biblical, like stoning someone. So when something, one punishment for people long ago would be to actually sort of tie them up, in the village square, and literally people would just line up and throw stones at them. And that was them sort of like, passing their judgment on that person. So to me, that has to do with the mother judging and to some degree sentencing her son based on that judgment. So being ready to stone him. And I guess from this, it seems like that's been going on for a long time. We do get an interesting sort of contrast here. So, is any time left for us in which to be happy, is how this stanza starts. The next stanza starts with, for the first time in my long life, I am almost happy. The book almost finished, almost seems good. The repetition of almost there is an interesting thing to think about. But it seems like he's finished writing a book, and this is bringing him some joy. But then we kind of come back to the themes of the first stanza again. Debts and inquietude persist and weaken me. Inquietude, by the way, is physical or mental restlessness or disturbance. So the idea of being restless, not able to focus. Satan glides before me. This is like an interesting moment in the poem too, this image of Satan. Like, so the idea that like some evil force is keeping him from doing the work. So this idea of like, just like, you don't need to work during the day. You'll do that tonight. But then night comes. And again, terrified by the arrears. If you weren't sure what arrears means, arrears, money that is owed and should have been paid earlier. So again, this idea of debt comes in. Bored by sadness, paralyzed by impotence. I do not think, just in case you were wondering, that this is referring to sexual impotence, but impotence in general can just mean like the inability to do anything. Right? There's more than one way to be impotent. So in this case, unable to perform some duty of which he would like to, probably writing. And then the idea, tomorrow the same comedy enacts itself with the same resolution, the same weakness. So like each day he's like, I'm going to go, I'll do the work tonight, and then doesn't because he's so terrified of what is to come. I'm sick of this life of furnished rooms. I'm sick of having colds and headaches. This could very well mean like living in different places. So the idea of like you would rent a furnished room, or meaning like you go rent an apartment and it would already have everything it needs for you. But that also usually means that you don't have your own things. You're just out there living in these places where everything's provided for you. Sick of having colds and headaches. You know my strange life. I think that's just sort of the poet admitting to his mom that she knows that this has been his life. Traveling from place to place, not having anything, being often ill. Every day brings its quota of wrath. So quota there just means like I'm getting my fill of wrath. Whether that means that it like, let's look up the definition of wrath. That's a fun one. I think we all kind of have an idea of what it means, but just for fun, extreme anger, chiefly used for humorous or rhetorical effect, that word there, right? And I think, I think because the word wrath is often sort of a little bit of hyperbole. So every day brings its quota of wrath. I think that could be either, hatred toward or anger toward him or his own anger. You little know a poet's life, dear mother. I must write poems, the most fatiguing of occupations. I think this like fatiguing of occupations and this must, right? It's not that he does write poems. He has to write poems. And I know a lot of writers will often tell you like, it's not that they want to write, they have to write. Like it's a thing. It hurts if they don't write. It's this yearning, aching inside of them. And the idea of that being sort of a fatiguing thing, like whether I want to or not, these poems are there. They got to come out. Last couple of stanzas here. I'm sad this morning. Do not reproach me. I write from, so I think this too, do not reproach me, comes back to the stoning thing. So reproach would be to like kind of, to judge somebody basically. So like, I'm not in a good place, so don't judge me this morning, Mom. I write from a cafe near the post office amid the click of billiard balls and the clatter of dishes, the pounding of my heart. The sounds there, I think, are interesting, and the fact that the pounding of the heart comes in as well. I've been asked to write a history of caricature. I've been asked to write a history of sculpture. Shall I write a history of the caricatures of the sculptures of you in my heart? That's a really interesting and important line that I'm not going to say too much about. In case you don't know, caricatures are, let's look it up. But if you think of a caricature, it's like those people who will make funny drawings of you. Like you pay them, they're like out on the street, like if you go like a boardwalk someplace warm probably. But caricature, a picture, description, or imitation of a person in which certain striking characteristics are exaggerated in order to create a comic effect. So you can see over here too in the corner, there's like this little picture of Barack Obama, and caricatures of him often would focus on his ears. That's a caricature. So that's an interesting idea. So I write a history of the caricatures, of the sculptures of you in my heart. So the sculptures that have been in some way crazy, exaggerated about his mother in his heart. That's an interesting idea. And then obviously the last bit of the poem is just the poet. I shouldn't say just the poet, but it's the poet Baudelaire, the speaker here, asking his mother for money. Although I think the lead up to that ask is very interesting and is meant to tell us something about the character as well. So it's a lot. I'm not going to give you more than that because I think I just talked you through a lot of the specifics of the poem and helped you at least understand it from a literal level. Now it's up to you to do a little bit of figurative work. This is your response to the prompt. You have a thesis that represents an interpretation and maybe establish a line of reasoning. Select and use evidence to develop and support your line of reasoning. Explain the relationship between the evidence and your thesis. Use appropriate grammar, punctuation, communicate. We're going to do all of those things, which is in a paragraph. So here's what I want from you today. I want a thesis statement that answers this question. I think the big thing here, right, is what are the choices? So what choices? Well, there's a few questions embedded in this one thing here. You'll notice too that this prompt doesn't at any point say, like, talk about the literary elements or anything like that, but it does, just in a backwards way. So let me explain that for a second. Couple of things. What is complex about Baudelaire? Like this character, the speaker here, Baudelaire, but the character that Schwartz has developed through this poem. What is complex about Baudelaire? So that's the most important thing. And then what choices does Schwartz attribute to Baudelaire that show this? And that's really like the literary element piece for this prompt. Like, what are the things that the speaker is doing, the way the speaker is speaking, the specific things the speaker chooses to talk about that show us what is complex about Baudelaire? And lastly, how do those choices show the complexity of Baudelaire's character? Again, that's a lot. But your thesis really should mostly just focus on the complexity of Baudelaire's character. So you also might want to kind of talk a little bit about the choices, though. So through blank choices, Baudelaire is shown to be blank. And that blank should probably be something, again, a complex description of who Baudelaire is as presented in this poem. But again, this one's pretty complex, guys. Overall, that's the most I think I've given you a lot. I hope that's helpful. You're going to be, if you don't watch this video, you won't know that. But for people who are watching this video, I think you know by now, if you didn't watch this video, this would be a lot harder. Good luck with this. It's all extra credit this week, but I do really encourage you to try to take advantage of it. And we'll be back again soon. Thanks for being here. Thanks for being awesome. See you soon.